welcome to our talk here tonight with Malcolm Purinton. It is one for the Revolutionary Road, which I like that, about taverns and their role in the revolution. I'm Deb Carroll, and I'm coming to you from the Golden Ball Tavern Museum in Weston. Sorry, I'm not looking right at you, but it's tricky to do that indeed. This is a historic house that was built in 1768 by a prominent Weston loyalist. So we tell the story of the American Revolution from the loyalist point of view. And he built it on the Boston Post Road, and it was home to 200 years, sorry, 6 generations, 200 years of the same time. We have a rich collection of household artifacts, furnishings, most each room is filled with items, I'm so sorry, that belong to the Jones family. About 90% of the items in our house belong to the Jones family. And we also have a rich collection of primary sources. So we have journals and ledgers, we have diaries, we have photographs, and all of this helps support the stories that we get to tell about the family. In particular, we have three big stories about the Revolutionary War, one of which we're celebrating right now. It's the 250th of the visit of General Gage's spies to the museum. And they were here 3 different times, three nights they stayed. And we have all of that detailed in a journal that they actually wrote of their travels, a copy of which ended up here at the museum, a hand copy. We also have a story about the Weston Tea Party that happened in 250 last year, in 1774, and the visit of Paul Revere's men in 1776. Excuse me. So we are a self-sustaining museum listed on the National Historic Register, the National Register of Historic Places. I always forget which way that goes. And we are open every Thursday from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. And again, every second Sunday of the month from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. And I feel a little jumbled up trying to fit all of that in at once. But just to say that it is a very unique historic house. It was preserved in a way that allowed each generation's stories to come to light. So they expose structural layers of change over time. So you can see things that the way that they are, the way that they were when we found the house, the way that they are preserved from the actual Revolutionary era. We have our tavern, which sadly many people ask if we serve beer, and we don't. But we have had beer tastings and other events. So in short, I think that if you want to know more about us, you should visit our website. You can, and you should also come and visit us here. We have a mailing list that you can join, and we have beer tasting events and other such things that happen here. But most importantly, we are delighted that we are able to present speakers such as Malcolm to sort of enlarge your knowledge of what happened during that time. And I'm going to let Malcolm tell you about himself, other than that we are grateful to have him here. He is known as the beer historian, and it's a subject that's very near and dear to the hearts of many here at the museum and beyond. So Malcolm, I'm going to hand this over to you.
All right, well, thank you very much, Deb, for having me here today. Welcome, everybody, to join us for this nice, lovely evening, though it's a bit cold here in Massachusetts. At least the sun is shining, finally. So I will just show you onto the PowerPoint right here that I can share so we can see where we're at. My name is Malcolm Purinton, professor, doctor. I am an assistant teaching professor at Northeastern University here in Boston, where I teach a number of things, among them the history of food, world history, technology, capitalism, lots of things, lots of things. Though everyone always kind of gets a little bit about beer as I'm doing that, because I've been studying the history of beer for good 20 years now. And my first book is all about the history of the Pilsner. It's called Globalization in a Glass. looking at why we have one global style of beer. And what's interesting about what we're going to be talking about today is that there weren't really too many styles of beer up until really the 18th century. But as we're getting into this 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, so many events going on right now. I mean, we're 251 years since, the Boston Tea Party, but next week we've got, the 250th anniversary of like Paul Revere and Dawes and everybody's like ride out Lexington and Concord, events happening all over the place. And so for tonight, I would like to kind of situate you into what life was like in colonial and revolutionary New England, especially in Massachusetts, looking around the Boston area. So today, this is one for the Revolutionary Road, Taverns in the American Revolution. So something we should think about is really just kind of what was coming over here with these immigrants, right? With these colonists, these settler colonists who were looking for, a new place to live. They were bringing not just themselves and their faiths, but also their culture, their way of enjoying society. And a big part of that from Europe is the tavern, a place where people could go and imbibe, but also just a social space for everyone to enjoy themselves, to relax after a day's work, to talk about the events of the life, of the politics, of everything. And this goes back, hundreds of years before we have the Mayflower. I mean, you didn't even really need a roof over your head to have a tavern. I mean, as this image shows from, about the 16th century, didn't need a roof. You've got a table, you've got some wine, you've got some beer, and people were enjoying themselves. So this was part of what the Puritans, the Pilgrims, what everybody was bringing to the Americas was this kind of way of life, this understanding of what was coming up next and how to enjoy themselves, how to really create that type of community. So if you look at the Mayflower, you've probably heard of it, bringing the Pilgrims over. And I mean, the Mayflower itself was already a rather old ship. It was known as a sweet ship because it had actually been spending several decades transporting wine between France and England. So it had already seen things. But the Mayflower bringing the Pilgrims over, it was packed, it was drafty, it was wet, it was not a good time to be traveling because they left several months later than they were planning on. And they didn't actually meet their destination. They were not actually looking for, a rock on the edge of the water in Plymouth. They weren't even trying to get to Massachusetts Bay at all. They were actually trying to get further south, south of Long Island. They were going to a place where they already knew English colonists would be, but they couldn't make it there. And why? I mean, I think they've been planning this for a while. They've been fleeing. They'd already made all these arrangements. But we have to remember that the sailors themselves were not pilgrims. They had to get back. And part of this travel was that they needed to be able to survive the journey to the Americas, but also get back. And water goes bad pretty quickly. Beer, however, lasts quite a long time. And so the sailors basically were just like, hey, I'm just going to sit you off here. We can't make it over through the shoals like around Cape Cod. We're going to set up shop right here. You all get off the boat. We're going to hang out, keep our beer to ourselves. Check it out. I mean, William Bradford writes about this. Basically, the Mayflower stopped in Massachusetts Bay because they were running out of beer. I mean, the sailors did eventually share all their victuals and everything like that. But this is such poor planning. So if we jump a little bit further ahead, we've got the Arabella. All right, 1630 or so, we've got the next shipment. We've got the Puritans coming in. And they planned ahead. You already had a nice little Salem, colony set up. Charlestown was already pretty well settled. Plymouth had its own thing going with the Pilgrims. But as they're coming in with like this flagship, the Arabella, they knew that they did not want to make the same mistake as the Pilgrims. And so on a ship of about 400 people, they had about 10,000 gallons of beer. They also had malt to make more beer. But they had enough beer for 4 pints a day for every person on that boat, every man, woman, and child. Because we also have to think about what beer is at this point in time. It's not just an intoxicant. This beer would likely be very low in alcohol. You don't need a high alcohol beer for it to be safer than water. Why? Because, well, it goes through a boiling process as it's being made. That kills off all those microorganisms. So the beer itself can be 1%, even less than that. But because it's been boiled and then it has alcohol additional and hops, also a good preservative, that beer is going to last a long time. So it was safe to drink for everybody, not with the goal of intoxication. Something that, even though they supported the drinking, the Pilgrims, the Puritans, everyone, they really abhorred the drunkenness. We hear about like the Scarlet Letter. Yeah, there was also a Scarlet D as well for drunkenness. Not a good thing. So they knew what they were expecting. When they start settling in the Shawmut Peninsula, starting the city of Boston, beer was a really important part of this journey of setting up a brand new city. And this culture that they were bringing across the Atlantic involved taverns. Needed a place for people to go, a place for people to stop as they're traveling. New England becomes populated with taverns all over the place, including, well, the Golden Bell Tavern, as you see an image right here. Not the interior of the Golden Bell Tavern, but a typical one. One would likely be, just full of people every evening and probably during the day. Because what were these places? We should not think of these places as saloons. We should not think of these places as bars. Taverns had multiple names. They were also called inns. They were also called ordinaries. They're also called, places of entertainment. But these were places where people would, stop on their way someplace. They need the place to refuel their horses, right? Feed and water the horses, feed and water themselves, a place to sleep. A tavern was a lot more than a place where you could buy alcohol. It was a place of community. It was a place of safety. Now, the very earliest license that we have, so here's a nice little image of 1633. Now, Pilgrims arrived 1620. We've got the Arabella and everyone, and founding of Boston, 1630. First licensed tavern, Cole's Inn, on what becomes Washington Street, in 1633. Now it's interesting because that was, 1 year after the church. Come on, looking at City on a Hill, it's a religious place that they're like trying to create. But it was actually 2 years before the first school, Boston Latin, really kind of emphasizing the importance of a tavern, of an inn, of an ordinary. And if we look at this too, Cole's Inn, you can see whose property that's on. Robert Sedgwick, he actually had the first license to brew beer. He was, and he had his own thing going on in Charlestown with that. So the inn tied directly to the brewer, it all works out. This little picture of the Lamb Tavern, where you can see you wouldn't have the name out front, but you would typically have an image, whether it was a lamb or a dragon, or anything like that, to, even if you couldn't read, you knew what to expect. You could find some warm stew, you could probably find some pretty warm beer as well, and you could find community. Now, one of the earliest institutions of Massachusetts was also the very first college, Harvard College. Notable for many, many things, but this is a place where, they were training ministers. And, people would be arriving, all these young ministers to get trained, then go out as they're settling across New England. But Harvard had to provide. They had to provide food. They had to provide drink. They actually had their own brewery right on Harvard campus because this was part of life. But if you stepped off campus into Cambridge, there's the Sister Bradage. This woman had a place, had her own ordinary, her own little tavern. And that's actually where these young ministers, future ministers, would love to hang out. But if you ask their parents, they were hanging out there a bit too much. So they actually reached out to Officer Dunster, Pastor Dunster, who was, the head of Harvard College, and complained about how much time their sons were spending at Sister Bradage's nice little tavern. And, because beer, it was only about a penny per drink. And as they were complaining, Dunster didn't believe it at all. Honestly, Dunster saw Sister Bradage as really useful for Harvard College because they didn't actually have to produce as much beer as would be expected for all of these young men. And we're talking about 16 years old and up, relatively young. So he told the parents, listen, nothing's going on here. We'll make sure they're only spending 1 penny per visit to Sister Babbage's place. It's all going to be good. Oh, yeah. Let's just tell Sister Babbage to keep doing what she's doing. Because also, sometimes these parents wouldn't be paying, any type of actual cash. They wouldn't have any money. They would actually be paying in food. They'd be paying in barley, in hops, in whatever like they could provide to give this education toward their young future pastors. So it was all part of Harvard College. You have the brewery, you have Sister Babbage, very important to our earliest educational institution in this country. Now, if we look at Becket Cole's Inn, first church, 1632, first inn, 1633, first school, Boston Latin, 2 years later. You saw these different institutions being built in every young town. Once you have a new town, whether it's Lexington, Concord, Lynn, you're going to have a church, first and foremost. You'll also have a meeting house, pretty much close right next to it. But then you would also need to make sure that you also had a tavern. Now, that would typically be very close to that meeting house. So nice little image right here of Lexington. And again, lots happening there next weekend. So you got the meeting house right there in the center. You got the belfry over on the side. And right nearby, right across that nice little road, Buckman Tavern. This is the center of the community of Lexington this time. You have the meeting house. This is where everything happens. People were not allowed to live within a half-mile farther than from a meeting house, all because they had to create that community. All the houses need to be close to the meeting house. You need to be able to survive the community. If there is a fire, everyone needs to be ready. If there's some other threat, everyone needs to be close by. And you're building a community. You're building religious communities in all of these new towns. So you have a church, you have your meeting house, and you also have your tavern. So much so, there was even a law passed by the Massachusetts court that you had to have a tavern. You had to have an ordinary, an inn. You had to have it within just a few years. So Lexington, Concord, they've got this rivalry going on for quite some time. Concord was actually almost fined for not having a tavern. They were threatened with these fines if they could not find someone who step up and start a tavern in the town. This is how important it was to this new Massachusetts Bay colony. You needed to have a tavern. And typically it'd be near a church. So this is the interior of King's Chapel today. But these churches had something that was very similar to the meeting houses. Now, the church is the place of worship, right? The meeting house is where you'd hold elections, you'd hold town meetings and things like that. But something that was very important to note about these different buildings is that, well, they were all made out of wood and they would not have fireplaces. And, well, right, it's not that cold today. It's pretty darn cold, honestly. In the 30s right now, welcome springtime. But we're looking at cold winters, right? We're looking at snow. And so while you'd be going to worship in the church, you'd be cuddled up in all of your furs and trying to stay warm. And you would go next door to the tavern as quickly as possible. If it's not warm enough outside, you would hold meetings. You would go from the church directly into the tavern. Now, a lot of these old taverns, they have very low ceilings. And something I remember like hearing when I was growing up was like, oh, they're very low because everyone was so short back in the day. No, not so much. These were very low ceilings because you needed to stay warm. You needed to be able to make sure this space was as warm as possible all year round. So you have a nice big fireplace, keeping that going, piping hot all day, and the tavern would become the inn, right? Why that law was put in was because you needed a place for travelers to stop by. You needed different colonies even had different laws of just making sure that they would get fined not just for not having a tavern, but even if just the inn itself did not have enough food or enough grain for the horses, if people were not taken care of enough, because if you have lots of travelers going through your town, you want to make sure they have a place to stay in the middle of the night. Because otherwise, where else are they going to go? Are they going to wake up the townspeople? Are they going to find a place in someone's barn? The inn, the tavern, the ordinary, it was a central piece of this whole fabric of colonies, of towns. And also, they were centers of community. They were centers of political community as well, political economy. Because while the meeting house would be a good place to hold elections, hold court, hold all of these things, If it's too cold out, all of that's going to be happening in a tavern. Whether you are in Boston, you are in Lynn, you are in Weston, the tavern was the place where you would have debates. It's the place where you would hold, the news of the day, where you would debate the news of the day, where you would hear about events happening in the town next over, in several towns next over, in a different colony, or even across the Atlantic in the metropole of England. Taverns were the centers of these communities. They were the warm meeting houses for all of these communities. And there were also institutions for other things. So if we look at a bunch of grapes, notable for the fact that, this is where they fested George Washington when he announced that the French were going to join on the American side during the Revolution. But it was also part of the Freemasons. Now, Freemasons were, their own institution within, the colonies across, worldwide, part of colonization in a lot of different eras. And so the tavern wouldn't be just that. It would be a political community. It would be a place that would be controlled by Masons and other political institutions, other fraternal institutions across these different cities. Now, as we get into the 18th century, Boston, Shawmut Peninsula right now, we can see here Long Wharf, and we can see all the different retailers and licensed inn holders. So the black dots right here, inn holders, and the retailers in gray. Now, that shows you just how many places you could stay the night, but also purchase some good beer. And by the 18th century, rum too. All the molasses coming up from the Caribbean, from the sugar islands of the enslaved in Barbados and others, rum becomes a very big deal. Demon rum in the 18th century. But we can see just the importance. I mean, how many people do we actually have within Boston at this point in time? Enough for them to have so many different inns / taverns, as well as just retailers of these different drinks. Now, demon rum becomes a really important part. People weren't drinking just beer. Some of these retailers specialized only in rum. That would be it. But there was also cider. Early American colonies, they had their own drinks to produce. The beer, while you'd have a barley beer, you would also have the very first pumpkin beers. Now, just basically be, you find some pumpkins, you smash that up, just looking for some type of fermentable sugar. A lot of these early beers also, whatever they could find, they would put in. Sometimes they would put in acorns. But, we also have hard cider. Thomas Jefferson being very notable for drinking 2 pints of hard cider every single morning. It's quite a lot. There's actually a pretty good book called The Alcoholic Republic, where it's kind of proven that between 1750 and about 1830, the American colonies, then the United States of America, was pretty lit. Honestly, the levels of alcohol that people were imbibing was rather massive. Just day in, day out. Europeans would come and visit and just write in their journals, and write letters back talking about just kind of how over the edge these Americans actually were. But it was also, if we jump ahead just a few years, looking at just how many more retailers there are, how many more inns there are. Because these places also, while they're centers of politics, they are centers of culture, they're centers of society and discussion and the news, they were also places of revolution. One thing, and a certain event that took place every single year, 5th of November, Guy Fawkes Day, right? Now, these colonists had left England, right? They had left the home of their ancestors, of their families, to go and start their own place, right? Their own colony, their own, almost quasi-nation before we even have the American Revolution. And one of the things that they were really against was the Pope. And, well, any type of Catholic leanings. So remember the 5th of November? Guy Fawkes Day becomes a central event in Boston, tied to taverns and tied to, well, a lot of inebriation. Now, what they would do is there was a couple gangs in Boston, notably just the North End gang and the South End gang. Now, the South End gang, they would hang out in the area that becomes known as, where the Liberty Tree is in the South End. And they would meet up. They were run by this guy named Ebenezer McIntosh. North End gang, they'd hang out, up in the North End. Still the North End that we can kind of picture today. On Guy Fawkes Day, they would each put together an effigy of the Pope. And they would get themselves pretty rowdy and then slowly start moving. The North End gang would start moving south. The South End gang would start moving north. And, well, when they met, they would start fighting. Now, the Pope, this effigy of the Pope, they'd have to make sure as they're going along, they would test to check out all the different taverns along the way before they met up with this other gang and have a big, big brawl. This was kind of like a minor purge for all of the law-abiding citizens of Boston. We're like, oh, we let them kind of let off all their steam at this one day of the year. Now, both gangs would be moving along, stopping every single tavern, asking, do you support us or do you support the Pope? Some of these taverns were just put in the window, just like a little, kind of like an X over the Pope, being like, no, we're totally with you. Because if you weren't with them, then, well, those windows might be smashed. And if you did not also provide these gangs with some free rum, free beer, whatever along the way, then you might also see your establishment in disarray, if you will. But these two guys, they would meet up, as we see from this image right here. They'd have their effigy, they'd be towing it through the streets of Boston. And when they met up, they would fight it out. Just, all, fisticuffs, no guns or anything like that. But whoever got the other person's, basically flag, which is like the effigy of the Pope, well, if the South End gang got it, they'd go over to the Common and they'd burn both popes. North End, they go up to Cobb's Hill, and then that's where they would burn both popes. These events took place every single year before the Revolution. Well before. But these gangs became quite useful during the Revolution to a number of the revolutionaries. Now, the Liberty Trees, these became places of gathering. And this is where they would protest, indignation of the Stamp Act, for instance, or the Sugar Act, or the Intolerable Acts. Going into the revolution, these step-by-step moments where they start realizing they're losing some of their autonomy that they've had over the previous couple hundred years as the English crown starts putting its foot on the necks of these colonists. So places like the Green Dragon, known because it had a nice copper green dragon out front. A couple men start meeting up there. It had become kind of over the purview of one of the Freemason groups in town. You had people like Samuel Adams, John Hancock. They were meeting there up on the third floor and start planning events, revolutionary events, ways to kind of push back against all of these British regulars that were kind of around town for a bit. Trying to find ways to push against these, acts, these financial acts against, the Stamp Act and so on. They were planning events. They called themselves the Loyal Nine. But soon, they would become the Sons of Liberty. They formed themselves as the Loyal Nine because of protesting the Stamp Act. And the Green Dragon becomes a place where also you had other major events planned out. There was the burning of a customs ship in Narragansett Bay. But perhaps most notable, you also had the Boston Tea Party. So while there was a big meeting going on in the South Meeting House, the Boston Tea Party, where they dressed up as Native Americans, drinking before they left. The plan was actually just to secure that tea. But it didn't quite get that far. It actually went much, much further. The tea was not quite secured, and instead they threw over millions of pounds worth of the East India Company's tea. After perhaps drinking a little bit too much before they went down to the docks and got on those ships. There's the beginning of this revolution. One of those revolutions where we find the taverns being central to the organization, the political organization, the cultural coherency of these colonists. These right here are all different images of Paul Revere's ride. 250 years ago, a week from Friday. And In each of these images, a tavern is central to where he is. Because while they were planning to figure out, like, where are the regulars going to go? Where are the redcoats going to go? Are they going to go by land? Are they going to go by sea? They knew that they were going to try and get all the way to Concord, try and get all of the guns and gunpowder and everything like that, the cannon that were there. And so they set these plans in motion. Paul Revere, while he becomes the most famous because of the famous poem, we also have Dawes, we also have Prescott, we also have these Sons of Liberty planning everything out. Now, Paul Revere stopped at taverns along the way. Now, why would he do that? Did he need a refreshment along the way? No, because this was the center of the community. And along his way, you see in blue, Paul Revere's route, and we have, we've got Dawes' route, we've got Prescott's route. Now, Paul Revere's very first stop, up in Medford, he stops at his friend's place, a tavern, because he's going to make sure the news gets spread as quickly as possible so that the Minutemen are all prepared for when the regulars do show up, to stop them in their tracks, to basically begin this revolution. Now, when he stops at each of these taverns, though, he does get some refreshment. Now, this first stop has a nice pint of rum, not beer, strong rum. As next stop, he stops at Hall's Tavern along the way. Make sure that Hall's going to get the news out to the whole community, which, I mean, by the end of this ride, by the end of this night, it's not just Massachusetts that knows what's going on. It is much of the entire New England that knows what's going on. Because you stop at each of these taverns, people are going to know all across the whole region. So he stops at every single tavern along this way. And at Hall's, he actually has 2 large glasses of rum. Perhaps this is why Paul Revere didn't actually make it to Concord and actually got captured by the British. Got let go, of course. But I mean, everybody else kind of got the full way. I mean, by the time he gets to Lexington, which is where Hancock was, meets up with Prescott, they get to Buckman's Tavern, and, they enjoy some refreshment there too. I mean, it's pretty late in the evening. Now, got Lexington right here, we've got the meeting house. And I mean, think about the April we're having right now. It's rather wet, it's rather cold. Are they going to hang out in the meeting hall? Not so much. Because when they get there, they got the belfry going, the Minutemen come right on out. No, they are lined up, they are ready to go. They've been planning for this, they've been training for this, but they still have many hours before dawn when the regulars are going to show up just around the right-hand side of this meeting house. So they have to be ready at a minute's notice. Are they going to go home? Are they going to try and get back to sleep? They're all pretty wired up at this point, but they got to stay awake for several hours. Then to go hang out in the meeting house, maybe have a nice long debate over, the choices of liberty. Not so much. You know where they went? They headed over to Buckman's Tavern. It's much closer. It's much warmer. And, well, there's a lot of really good beer to be had and rum in Buckman's Tavern. So over the course of that night, they have several hours where they're staying awake, not getting rest, and drinking. So when you hear about the ragged line of Minutemen who show up against the British regulars, and the first shots of this revolution are fired, they're probably not in the best of shape, quite honestly. And which is probably why, the Redcoats are able to just continue onwards and get themselves to Concord. Look at this one. So, these are among my favorite of the images where you have all in lines, nice professional lines. You got the regulars all over the place. Still don't know where that first shot was necessarily fired or by whom. But clearly in this, we can see the belfry, we can see the meeting house, we can see the tavern, we can see how the artist is setting up the Battle of Lexington with the ragged Minutemen in the foreground and the much more sober, much more trained, better trained British regulars. And those regulars made it all the way to Concord. Centering this image right here is not just this nice line of redcoats, view looking down from the graveyard that the burial ground that you can still stand on today. But what is the center of this image? Well, it's a red building. And that red building happens to be Warren's Tavern. Central to the Battle of Lexington Concord, because this was where the provincial Minutemen, this is where the Patriots set up shop first. And then the British took it. Provincial Congress on the eve of the Revolution, sat by a large body in the meeting house close by, headquarters of the Minutemen, early morning of April 19th, 1775. Later that day, the headquarters of the British under the command of Colonel Smith and Pitcairn. They're not setting up shop in the meeting house. They are headquartering in the tavern, the center of the town. It's a good thing that Concord did listen, when they were about to be fined, 150 years before this, so we could have this nice, memorable, historic moment in Concord. But taverns played a big role across these early years of the Revolution. Where we have right here in what becomes the state of Vermont, in Bennington, Vermont, we had the Catamount Tavern. Now, why do I mention this? Because, well, when those redcoats, those regulars, as they were pushed all the way back to Boston, the Shawmut Peninsula, and they're basically surrounded by the Patriots, right? By the American revolutionaries. And that begins the siege of Boston, which is only going to be broken when cannon arrives onto Dorchester Heights. Now, where did that cannon come from? Well, it's not the small little cannons that they were trying to find Lexington and Concord. No. They had to get some really big guns. So, hang out at the Catamount Tavern were another revolutionary band called the Green Mountain Boys, led by Ethan Allen and his brother Ira. They're hanging out there. And while they're supposed to be waiting for this patriotic general, later, traitor, Benedict Arnold, they decide, you know what? Let's just go over Fort Ticonderoga right now and get us some cannon. So they start making their way over to Lake Champlain, to Ticonderoga and Crown Point. One thing that Ethan Allen was known for was his level of drunkenness, quite honestly. He wasn't a very nice guy, and he really enjoyed his liquor. So they got all riled up. They start making it over there well before Benedict Arnold. When he shows up several hours later, he's a little bit pissed, and he rushes over to try and catch up to them before they get on some rickety boats, go over to Fort Ticonderoga. There's only about like 40, 50 British soldiers there, and they basically just kind of walked in, put a gun to the general's head and said, hey, we just took over Fort Ticonderoga. If you see in the background right there, we got some cannon. They take it over quite easy. Benedict Arnold comes in too, and then Henry Knox shows up, and over the course of that winter, they take those cannon all the way to Boston, all the way the length of Massachusetts, and set up all around the Shawmut Peninsula in Boston. And the siege ends as the British regulars flee in their ships out of the Boston harbor. Shortly thereafter, George Washington, now the head of the Continental Army, comes in, and he shows up in Cambridge Common to take over the new Continental Army. Now he wants to make sure, the Continental Congress, that what type of provisions are going to be held for this new Continental Army. Well, water, we know that's going to go bad pretty quickly. So we're going to make sure all of these soldiers are allowed to have 1 quart of spruce beer or cider per man per day for health, or 9 gallons of molasses per company of 100 men per week. Now, molasses, that would be because you have to have a still nearby, so that molasses could be converted into rum. This was definitely a lot more about that liquid courage that would be coming along, but it was a provision for this Continental Army, straight through. Taverns played a role throughout the American Revolution. Well, for instance, this one, the 1776 house in Tappan, New York, housed General Nathaniel Greene. Its claim to fame. But then also the major cities, that these revolutionary cities of New York, of Philadelphia, of Boston. The taverns are central to the meetings of the Continental Congresses, meetings of these new American politicians that are planning out a constitution. They're planning out all of these new amazing documents. So here, the Francis Tavern, New York, hosted Washington and all others, also in 1776. And then City Tavern in Philadelphia. Well, Philadelphia, everyone's hanging out, they're planning the Bill of Rights, doing all the. This is where everyone went afterwards. This is where everyone headed to make sure that all of their planning, all of their dreams would continue on and make sure that this revolution would be successful. Thank you very much. Thanks for joining. And now I will open it up to questions from all of you. You can put them right into the chat on the side if you like.
So you have someone asking if there were dry towns at this.
Say again?
Were there dry towns at this time? That's the
Oh, no.
question.
This is also, I mean, we have to think about, again, what beer really is. Because beer is not it. Well, honestly, rum, they were trying to get rid of the intoxicants of rum. Kind of similar to what we'll see about, 60 years later as we see like the anti-saloon league building up in the late 19th century. Beer was actually advocated for by Samuel Adams himself, who was a maltster, not a brewer, because he was trying to make sure that rum being tied to the British Empire, wine also a major import from the British Empire, he was advocating for all of the patriots to focus on drinking just local beer. Locally brewed malts, grains. I mean, in the late 18th century, like we've got John Adams writing to each other about like the barley crop in Braintree. Um, you know, all of that. It was very key to trying to advocate for an American industry. Hard cider as well. Johnny Appleseed, this guy wasn't planting like, nice Macintosh apples. He was planting small, knobby, incredibly tart apples specifically for hard cider. So what they were trying to do is trying to divorce themselves from any type of dependence upon their new enemy of the crown. So dry towns, not at all. You need to have a places for people to go, and hopefully, not focus on the intoxicants. That was definitely more of a more urban kind of Boston scene, focusing on kind of like the locally brewed beer that they would have available.
I see another question here from Alexander. It says, thanks for the chat. Was the alcohol percentage in the beer and cider significantly lower than today? If I recall, even children drank beer back in the colonial era. So was everyone very tipsy or just a bit so?
Well, it was more about volume, I think. So it was rather low alcohol, but they would also, as they were brewing beer, typically where they brew several different beers from the same malted grains. So typically, like the first time that you'd be like making a beer, there'd be a lot more sugar available from those grains, and so the beer itself would be, roughly looking at like a high point of maybe 6 to 7% tops. But then they usually like run the water through again, make another beer, you get down to about 4%. But then you'd also have a table beer or a breakfast beer, right? Something that would be much lower on alcohol, maybe 1%, 1.5, very little sugar like available for the yeast to convert into alcohol. And so basically it would be something that people would be drinking throughout the day, whether you're working in the fields, you're working in the home. It would be something that would be safe for everyone to drink because of the boiling. Again, not the high alcohol content. The higher alcohol content would be, either for sale like kind of at the retailers or kind of like a higher cost beer that you could get in the taverns themselves. And now I do see the questions. Do women meet up anywhere? Ah, so part of kind of like, we're looking at two different spheres. We've got the public sphere, so meeting houses and the taverns. While after church, kind of everyone would gather, for like events, women would typically be at the home, but they would be brewing beer in the home. It was definitely kind of, they'd be making bread. Something when I was doing my beer tours back in the day, the three B's of kind of like, a colonial or like medieval life for women would be uh, bread, babies, and beer. Three things that would be produced. And so beer would be imbibed, but it'd be the lower alcohol content. And so women would be typically, if they met up together, it would be more in the home. The tubs. Yes, the pubs of Britain, similar to the old taverns of America. Quite similar. Um, where you can still see that kind of like feeling when you get into like a British pub where I mean, the wood of the interior, a lot of them do have, just kind of like a very cozy feeling. So that would be a lot more similar to those early taverns because you want these taverns to be large enough for people to fill, for the town, for like any types of town meetings and things like that. But also with that low ceiling, make sure it was warm enough for everybody to be there. So definitely lot similar, more similar to the British pubs of today than, a tap room of a local brewery. Was the religious intolerance of drinking gone by the 1700s then? Ah, so if we had to look at what type of alcohol, and also like the religious intolerance for drunkenness continued to exist, but drinking alcohol, drinking beer, wine, things like of that nature, that was never looked down upon. It was the overindulgence. So that's why you have, say, like the Scarlet D of drunkenness. You be put into the stocks, you might be whipped for drunkenness, things like that. But everyone, you weren't seeing beer and all of these different things as something that would be a threat. Rum, demon rum, that was definitely less, people were less tolerant, but Boston and this region was kind of an international port. So you have to look, there was a lot of people who were not pilgrims, that were not part of the religious establishments that were here or the religious faiths. And so you have a lot of taverns, especially like along like the wharfs and so on, where you have, people from all over the globe coming through, drinking rum, drinking wine, drinking whatever was available. So the religious intolerance wasn't necessarily for drinking, it was for intoxication. So definitely a distinction that needs to be made along that. So when we see dry towns are more of a, let's say, a hangover from Prohibition. So like the 1920s in the United States, and like the latter half of the 19th century, and we see the buildup of, you know, the Anti-Saloon League, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, who are all calling for temperance, similar to kind of the late 18th century, where you have Demon Rum. Anti-Saloon League isn't an anti-tavern league. Very different. They were all calling out the whiskey drinking, the hard alcohol drinking. Beer was even advocated for in the late 19th century by temperance organizations for something that was safe to drink, almost the same type of way that Samuel Adams was calling for beer to be drank because both, I mean, it's safe to drink, but also it's not part of the empire. It's not part of the crown's, like monopoly of trade. So trying to keep those differences right there. So were the British soldiers kept from drinking or given something else to drink? Oh yeah, I mean, well, before the crown and the English become the enemy, we're all British, right? Before you have the loyalists and like the patriots, you have we're just all English. We're all just British. And so until we get to the point of like the Intolerable Acts and like the Stamp Act and like, the Boston Massacre, you know, they were living like within like the society. I mean, British soldiers were settling in, like they were marrying local women. I mean, this was part of, they were part of the same society. That's what they all kind of saw. So they weren't necessarily kept from drinking at all. They would be going to perhaps their own taverns. I mean, there's certainly enough that, different groups could go to different taverns at any time, right? But they weren't limited as much. I mean, that's one of the reasons why after the Boston Massacre, they were all sent over to Castle Island, removed from like the local community to try and remove that. But you had a brewery there. You had local production among across the 18th, 19th century. The British Navy had their own very large breweries for their expensive empire of navy. So yeah, they would be equally drunk a lot of times, though not in battle. I noticed wine was not mentioned as part of the tavern experience. Was it only afforded to the upper crust of society, if much at all? Yeah, pretty much. Pretty much. Wine, I mean, it was an imported product. You don't see local wines being produced here in Massachusetts or in New England at all, really. So wine was going to be something that was imported, taxed, cost a whole lot more. I mean, the molasses would be coming through anything made of sugar, like those drinks, rum, that would be much cheaper. because a lot of times also that's why they had the Sugar Act was basically they were trying to stop the smuggling of like rum and all like molasses and sugar into the American colonies because they weren't paying taxes back to England itself. So wine only, especially Madeira wine, actually in the 18th century, that was the most popular for all of those leading patriots, the rich men of the town. So it was definitely a class difference between what people would be drinking. Demon rum, lower, lower like poorer classes. Wine, upper crust. Similar to actually what you'd see in the metropole in England itself too.
Malcolm, it's Deb again. I was just, as you're talking and I'm looking at this particular uh, piece of artwork and wondering about the source of it and is it a potential depiction of reality or not?
This, well, no, this one's definitely a more of a joke. I mean, this would be if we could look at the people who are in this image, you could see this is likely a graduation type of thing. You see the wine on the table, you see, a chiller right there. So you're looking at like more of like a sparkling, again, kind of a sparkling like champagne wine. So it is going to be, this is, you can also see the people there have just graduated with their hats. Oops. There we go. So this one's definitely more of a likely more of actually a British scene itself. But it's hard to find something that's coming from the 18th century that shows all of the levels of what people were enjoying. You even have an officer here in the corner. Oh yes, type that in. Mhm. There we go. Um, So yes, so my book is actually on like the latter half of the 19th century. Um, this era is fascinating because I mean, I grew up like learning about like the importance of the Green Dragon, especially, like looking at that loyal nine that becomes the Sons of Liberty that, such a central, it was like the jumping off point for the Boston Tea Party. And the roles of the taverns, both in kind of fueling, like once, we have the North Gang and the South Gang of Boston become just kind of the ones that were kind of riled up by the people like Samuel Adams, who himself was more of a great just kind of orator, and he was a real rabble rouser. We have Hancock as like, the rich guy up on top of the hill who's like, funding a whole lot of stuff and like, big leader. But we also have Samuel Adams, who is like, all right, let's see if we get Macintosh on board here. Get like, get the gangs together and have them start pushing like the buttons of the British regulars. Let's have them start kind of like starting riots in town and kind of getting the whole population to like start seeing this revolution as a revolution. Not just a Guy Fawkes once a day, like once a year, but it's going to be something that brings the entire community together through riots, through protests, and they're going to be meeting at the taverns. They'll be planning all of these different places because that space, that tavern, that inn, that ordinary had become so central to what it meant to be part of American colonial society. It was the place where people planned. It was the place where politics was discussed. It was the place where the news was shared. And so for me, as I've been like working through like learning so much more and like, writing more about this point in time, it kind of really, you can see how the flow of, well, the beer and the, oh, I've got some tea going right here to keep my mouth, keep myself going. Um, Thanks for asking though. I'm looking forward to having a sip of sunshine after this, actually. So yeah, it is something that I've just really enjoyed seeing like how this happens. Because at this same point in time, in the 18th century, we start to see different styles of beer becoming known. Samuel Adams actually advocates for a very specific type of beer. It's called an October beer, which was the strong beer that came out in the fall, one that would be, including a whole lot of hops. The October beer is kind of the OG India Pale Ale. Now, we don't see the term India Pale Ale being used for another like 50 years, but that style originates in that October beer that Samuel Adams is actually advocating for in the late, in basically the 1770s. It's kind of neat seeing how we can jump all around the world and kind of see how everything kind of ties itself together.
That just leads me to, so Samuel Adams Brewery is not just a nod to Samuel Adams. It's historically accurate that he was the beer person.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, it comes from a maltster family. Basically, you need malted grain in order to be able to make the beer. So he was tied into the alcohol. Well, he didn't. He decided not to take over after his dad. But the family was a long time like maltster family. And actually, a funny little piece about that: when Jim Koch was trying to come up with a name for the Boston Beer Company for like the major brand, he hired a marketing company, and uh, they came up with a number of different names. One of them being Cod Ale, because of the sacred cod ale. Because like in cod was such an important part of Boston, like early Boston history, and so that was one of the ideas. Can you imagine if you weren't going up to get a Sam Adams lager? It would be, well, let's have a sacred cod. So Jim Koch himself actually came up with the name for Samuel Adams for the beer, which I love that little piece of that story. Um, where did you? Ah, a lot of my information comes from. Oh, geez, I'm not sure how many books. So some of the images I showed actually of the when looking at the Continental Congress, like the rationing. So that's from the Massachusetts Historical Society. I also go through the records at the Boston Public Library. A number of the kind of like the old kind of like resource, the primary documents. But then I also try and look at, different works, looking of secondary sources by other scholars, looking at the history of taverns in, the early modern era in England, in Europe, looking at some of the, works like Rohrbaugh's Alcoholic Republic, where he doesn't focus on New England, but looks at kind of colonial society and alcohol consumption. It's somewhat dry, but I find it really fascinating. So I basically go through, probably for this information, probably about 10, 15 different books, as well as, a couple days of primary source research. I mean, which is honestly so much fun for me.
So I am trying very hard to figure out how to show myself back here on the screen. I don't know if I am or not,
Yes, you
but
are.
um, I just that was a great ending question, and I just want to say on behalf of the Golden Ball Tavern Museum, thank you so much for this, Malcolm. It was so fascinating and fun and lively, interesting. And for everyone who attended, we'll send out a link to the recording so you can either watch it again or share with others. And ultimately, it will end up on our YouTube channel. There we are. I can see myself now. It will end up on our YouTube channel and can be shared and watched. And yeah, hopefully this continued interest might lead to yet another book. I know you put your book information in the chat. We'll certainly reiterate your website and your Instagram page and all of that for people to find you who don't already know how to do that. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me. This was a pleasure. I love talking about this stuff.
What fun, and enjoy your sip of sunshine. Yeah, and thank you to all the participants. Thanks for coming. Thanks for supporting us. And we look forward to more of this and to welcoming you to the museum someday.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you so much. Good night to all.